want to do some kind of basic knowledge about who are Livonians, what is Livonian history, and also what is Livonian contemporary time. So, as I said, Livonians are indigenous people of Latvia. Livonians are Finno-Ugric tribe, indigenous specifically to Latvia. So there has been times in history that Livonians have lived a little bit within southwest Estonia, just near the Latvian border. But Livonians, Livonian home is and has always been Latvia. For those who have followed the newest research in archaeology and in genetics, there are actually quite interesting developments and interesting researches on how Livonians and Finnic people in general, where do they come from and how did they get to the places where they live today. And probably most of you know about the Finno-Ugric language group and particularly about Finnic languages, which are Finnish, Estonian, Livonian, Ingrian, Baltic, Karelian, and Veps. But according to the newest research published by Walter Lang, professor of archaeology in Tartu, so he was trying to answer the question how did the Finnic people get here, from where, and how this history went. So in that research he tried to combine three different aspects. So because usually linguists look through the linguistic perspective, through the languages, archaeologists look from the artifacts that they dig out from the ground, and genetics look for actually very big pictures of how people are related between themselves. So when these three disciplines comes together, and this is what Walter Lang did in his research, and he published 2 years ago a monography about arrival of Finnic people. And in that monography he describes that Finnic people were arriving to the coast of the Baltic Sea through river Daugava. Daugava, which is also known as Väinä in Finnish, which is the main river of Latvia. And then Livonians were actually the first people who stayed there. And then afterwards all the others went north and started splitting, becoming Finns, becoming Estonians, becoming Karelians. So basically if we talk about Latvia, so Latvia is not only a place where Latvians were born, but it was actually the place where Finnic people was born altogether. So basically it's actually Finnish homeland as well, a little bit. And of course, this relation, so people sometimes ask like how different or close Livonian is to Estonian and Finnish. And I would say that Estonian and Finnish are maybe more close than Livonian, because Livonian is kind of older, it's veered off, it is, and it has been in very long time in contact with Baltic languages, so it's especially sound-wise, it sounds quite different. You will hear afterwards, for Baiba will read her poems, and just I will give a couple of examples. Maira will help me with that. So I will read in Livonian 1 to 10, and Maira will try to do the same in Finnish. So Estonian is somewhere in the middle. So 1, yksi, kaks, kolm, neljä, viis, kuus, seis, koodeks, ideks, kim. So there are similarities, but sound-wise it's actually very, when Finnish people or Estonian people they try to read Livonian text when it's published, written down, then actually you can get pretty much what the story is about. But once you hear it, it's almost impossible to even distinguish words. So this is a small map. Maps are actually important. Maps show quite a lot of of what's happening in the world. So Livonians used to inhabit actually quite big area in Latvia. So in today's term of, if you look at today's Latvia, so areas populated by Livonians somewhere in the history is almost 1/3 of the country. So this is of course River Daugava surroundings, then all around the Riga Gulf. Actually Riga Gulf in Estonian is called Livonian Gulf, Liivilaht. And Livonians also lived where today, current day Riga is. So in Riga was actually built to avoid building German city within Livonian settlements, but it was still built on 2 villages that belonged to Livonians. So and a hill fort as well. So Livonians actually are very old in terms of history. First time Livonians were already mentioned in 11th century in Russian chronicle. Also there is a chronicle of Henricus that is meant so that usually is perceived as a source of Latvia's and Estonia's ancient history. So it talks about 13th century, about Germans coming to these areas. But if we look without this contemporary view, this is basically a story about Livonians and their neighbors. And this is also a book where the first Livonian phrase is recorded. It's actually first Finnic phrase ever recorded in general, and it's maga magamas that Livonians are saying to Estonians, and just in the next sentence the first Estonian phrase is recorded where Estonians are answering Livonians magatak. So also the oldest buildings in Latvia, like first church in Ikstile or Yksi kylä, is actually built in Livonian settlements. So this is the reason why we come back to this Latvia as a homeland for Finnic people, but it is also this Livonian presence is what has defined today's Latvia. If we because it is huge area that Livonians were living, and if you look at contemporary Latvian, and of course by the time lots of Livonian has had, and Livonian culture has had enormous influence on how Latvian looks like. There is maybe the most easier to see signs are in Latvian language. Those who have been in Latvia have noticed that Latvian language has stress on the first syllable, just like Finnish and Estonian does, and that's Livonian. There are many words in Latvian like puika, which is the same Finnish poika. There are, for example, maksat, maksa, and many more words being used on everyday basis. But the best, for those of you who can see the map, so you can see that there are these Livonian areas, but if we look contemporary on the Latvian dialects and how Latvian sounds like, so that we can see that actually this green part is what is base, it's a mid-dialect of Latvian, it's a base of Latvian literary language. So this, and if you compare these two maps, just switch forwards and backwards, then you can see that actually this green line goes on a border between Livonians and other Baltic tribes living at that time in Latvia. Latgalians in eastern Latvia, Semigalians, South and Silonians, and also Curonians on the western part. So, and here these blue are actually Livonian-like Latvian dialects, which have even more of Livonian impact than normal standard Latvian. So basically what they represent, you can see the same areas. That's actually a question where the people go. So how does extinction looks like? How does the nation becomes extinct? And sometimes it's perceived just like a person dying, that person dies and nothing stays, but it's actually languages and cultures do not go extinct like that. So people stay, cultures changes, cultures are changing, languages are switching, and they are retaining something from what they take over, but people don't die. And what this map actually shows, that Livonians, after those 800 years, Livonians are still there. So they are speaking Latvian, some varieties of Latvian, but there is still this Livonian base under it. So, and that actually makes it quite, in terms of how to define what is Livonian and what is not, it makes it actually quite hard to do that. Because on one hand, Livonian is something very different from Latvian. So it's a separate language, it's a separate cultural layer, it's a separate community. On the other hand, Livonian and Latvian are the same, because they are the same people, there are the same traditions integrated in Latvia. So Livonians are kind of integrated and disintegrated at the same time. So this history that 800 years ago is very different from what is now, and how does it look today. So during that period of 800 years, Livonians got more and more, switched the language and became, together with other Baltic tribes living in Latvia, became what is contemporarily known as Latvian. But they also somehow managed to stay, and they managed to actually to stay even two dialects in mid of 19th century. So there are two Livonian languages on each side of Riga Gulf. One was in Vidzeme, so-called Salats Livonian. In mid of 19th century, there was about approximately 20 speakers recorded by the Finnish scholar Anders Johan Sjögren, who was actually the last one to record Salats Livonian. And then there was Livonians in Kurland, in this northernmost top of Kurland Peninsula, which is actually also known as the Livonian Coast. And so Livonian Coast is actually quite, it has quite interesting history. And that actually is also behind the fact why Livonians managed to stay for so long time. So these are 14 fishermen villages in the northernmost top of Kurland. And those fishermen villages are geographically have always been very isolated. So the coast itself formed when the sea went backwards. And there were, because of Latvia, all Latvia's sea coast is basically sandy beach. And on a sandy beach you can see that there is a dune, and then there is like lower place and next dune, and etc. etc. So, and the same landscape actually stayed in Livonian Coast, only these dunes became small long hills called Kangar in Livonian, place name which is also found near the Riga as well. And then those lower places became filled with water. So it made actually access to Livonian Coast almost impossible, because you could not move through it. And if you fly over, so currently flying to Finland you can't see it because plane goes somewhere here. But if you fly from Riga to Stockholm, you fly directly over the Livonian Coast, and then you can, and also on Google Maps you can see those long stripes going along the coast, and these are these old dunes. And what the landscape of Livonian Coast is, it's actually it's sandy. You can do nothing, no agriculture, so nothing grows there. It's entirely connected with fishing, and all the villages that the people who go there, they somehow think that they are just normal village places, but these are places where wind blew this sand around, making bigger, flatter fields. Then people came, then people fertilized all this ground, so they built, it's actually artificially built those fields where the villages are on, because historically it has been the same picture. And it was much easier for Livonians to go to either Estonian island of Saaremaa or to Ruhnu to visit Swedes from Ruhnu Island than to go inlands. It took actually much more time to get to Dundaga, which is center of parish, than to just cross the sea to other places. And this was the reason and the difference in lifestyle that kept Livonians in this Livonian coast for so long. And Livonians have during the last 200 years, there has not been many Livonians in general. So it's not like there was like 500,000, and now there is few of them. In mid of 19th century in Livonian Coast, there were approximately 2,500 Livonian speakers. So I guess that it's one block in Helsinki. In 20th century, in 20s, 40s, there was about 1,000 Livonian speakers. So today it is still spoken by 30 people. So this is actually, for me, it has always been maybe the biggest mystery, not the fact that, because usually people try to think like, why did Livonians disappear? And I try to answer the question, how did Livonians survive so long? Because there are very many nations who have disappeared. Prussians, for example, Olmecs. So you can go around the world and find nation by nation by nation who have disappeared in the history. And Livonians have survived since beginning, since 13th century, through all the including the 20th century, which has been especially harsh towards Livonians, and they are still here and still present and still continuing to live. So, also along with the separation from inland, Livonian Coast not only retained traditions connected with the sea, and but it also retained quite a lot of different intangible culture, like folk costumes, like folklore. It's an enormous amount of Livonian folklore actually recorded. So usually people are trying to measure like how much units of folklore we have per person. So for Livonians of 1920s, there were 8 folklore units per person recorded. So if you currently, if you take them down for 30 Livonians, it's of course much better statistics, although not in a good way. But there are also some traditions and also like in very simple things that are still living, like for example food. So Livonians have some ways of making food which are quite special. One very characteristic thing, for example, for Kurland Livonians, is mixing meat with fish, which is quite general, or mixing fish with milk products, which in eastern Latvia, for example, people don't understand how it's possible and why it should be done. But the reason is quite clear, because you have much more fish than you have a meat, and so you use fish just to extend meat, etc. So and there is also one. Actually, I don't have picture. Actually, one interesting kind of pie, which is actually quite known in Latvia. It's called sklandrausis. This is a heritage food from Kurland. It's also lately has been included in European food heritage list. And but it reminds for you, it's actually quite familiar because it reminds Karelian pie, only it's filled. It's a rye-based pie, but it's filled with potato mash and carrots. And carrots are actually innovation of Kurland. But if you look in Kurland, then you can see carrot pies only in northern part, that type of Kurland, because southern there is a little bit different. So they're not pies; they are bigger breads. So this is actually also one piece of heritage that has been integrated from true Livonians into contemporary Latvian culture. So in 20th century, this Livonian coast actually, it was through all the centuries, it was very peripheral. So nobody actually needed that. People stayed quite isolated with their lifestyle and everything. But in 20th century, 3 things happened in a row that absolutely changed all Livonian history entirely. So first thing was First World War. when German army was actually entered territory of Latvia, and it was occupying one part of Latvia, namely this Kurland, western part. The people, many Livonians already fled before the German coming, so they fled the coast. But on the Estonian island at the same time was standing Tsar Russian army. So and Germans were fearing that Russians will attack over the straits, and they ordered all the people who stayed there to leave the homes. And that's what they had to do. And also this western part of Livonian coast was also entirely burned down. So there's only one house actually that has survived that era. In Livonian it's called Ulzaita, which means expelling time. And the only house surviving it is currently on the show at Latvia's Open Air Museum in Riga. So from Lūž. And then people living 4 or 5 years in exile started to come back after First World War. And they resettled, and they had to actually rebuild everything. And especially, again, remembering that it's impossible to make any agriculture. So it's entirely fishing-based village lifestyle. So the same thing happened again in the Second World War, because the situation was again the same. And Kurland was occupied by German army. In Saaremaa was Russian army, and also people were ordered out from the coast. So it was second expelling time for Livonians, and of course people who fled west or were taken out east to Siberia. And then when people again came back to the Livonian coast, then the third thing and the final attack that happened was that all the western coast of Latvia was declared border area of the Soviet Union. That meant one thing, and it meant that you were not allowed to fish individually, so you were not allowed to have a boat and go on to the sea to fish, which basically means that villages that are dependent on fishing industry, you can't find any work there. It was very different in this sense from all the other areas in Latvia or Estonia as well, or Lithuania, because in all these areas, except maybe Curonian Spit, in all these areas, if you could not fish, you could just turn inlands and start doing some agriculture, because there is fertile land just next to the sea. Livonian coast is only one that doesn't have in Latvia such an opportunity. So it basically meant that all Livonians from the Livonian coast had to go away, and this ended in the situation that since 50s we have the largest Livonian community in Riga, then Ventspils town follows, and then an only one in Livonian coast where you have like some significant number of Livonians, which is 15. If I am not misled, it's Kuolka, because Kuolka was situated in the Riga Gulf, just behind the corner, and there were collective fishing enterprise there. So this was the place where some people found their jobs. And this coast actually was heavily militarized in the west and turned into environmental protection area in the east, which was quite odd, because what this border area meant that you could not actually access the sea in no way. So there were just on all Livonian coast in the open sea, there was only 2 places that you could access the sea, and only during daylight hours, and only during the summer period, and only under surveillance. So for people living there in villages with in other villages, so you could have a kind of, you could hear the sea, but you couldn't have any visual contact with the sea, because you just knew that it's there like 100 meters away, but you could not go there. And then when this nature reserve expanded, so it's actually currently it's Slītere National Park, and now it's entirely different. But in the Soviet time, it was quite odd, because people left and nature stayed, and so this nature reserve expanded. but it reached the point that it actually was forbidden to go to the wood either. So these people living in villages, so they were they couldn't go to the seacoast because there was a barbed wire and there's bodyguards. They could not go to the woods because there was forbidden zone of nature protection area. So it was very, very kind of strange time, actually, these 60s, 70s, and 80s. And you can, if you go to Livonian Coast, you can actually see remnants of these times. There are, like for example, in Nīre, or in Latvian Mazirbe, there is the famous boat cemetery, where boats that were actually forbidden to use at the sea were taken together behind the dunes and left, and also in other villages the same. So Livonian Coast, actually, so there are lots of things that stayed from this time, but it still was Livonian area. So it is still very strongly connected with Livonian contemporary culture and with Livonian contemporary community as well, which is actually not big. It may leave unproportionally the idea of a proportionally big impact, but it's actually, so today you have 250 people who are declaring themselves Livonians, and out of them, as I said, approximately 30 language speakers. So, but the actual number of Livonians are bigger, much bigger indeed, because those 250, I would say that these are people who feel more like Livonian than they feel being Latvian. But people with Livonian origin, people who are actually, who would the very same way be Livonians, are actually much more. So just today, there was an interview published in newspaper Ir with Inga Abele, who is a famous Latvian writer, and she is actually Livonian descendant, and her grandmother used to talk Livonian, and she also taught her some phrases in Livonian. So this is this layer is actually much bigger. But if we go back now to Livonians themselves, so Livonians form kind of also separate. And this is this disintegrated part that I'm now getting into. There is kind of separate Livonian cultural layers. So Livonians have their own flag, which is a nice marker for any nation to have. And actually the flag will celebrate in 2 years. It will celebrate the 100 years anniversary. So it was adopted in 1923, and it's green, white, and blue. So the explanation for that is that's Livonian Coast on a flag. So there are green woods, white sand, and blue sea under it. So it's a picture when a fisherman is on the sea, and when he looks back at the coast, that this is what he sees. This is actually an interesting flag because it was first one to use Latvian proportion as a reference to Latvia. So the same approach is used today by many Latvian regions and towns. Also, Livonians since 1923 have anthem, and anthem is it has quite famous melody. It's the same melody that Finnish and Estonian anthems have. So Livonians were third in a row when, and they just took the same melody. But what they did is that Finnish anthem has two, right? Panti. So two verses, two rhymes. Yeah. The Estonian 3, and Livonian, of course, 4. So, especially in 20s, I already mentioned Andres Johan Sjögren in mid of 19th century, but also in 20s, 30s, there was this period together with Latvia's independence, but also this Livonian national awakening took place. So, and lots of Estonian and Finnish scientists also and culture people participated in that. So they helped actually to publish books in Livonian to make a Livonian newspaper, to make even Livonian society in general in 1923. In 30s, it was especially Finns who actually helped Livonians to develop. So newspaper was published by with the support of money collected in Finland. New Testament was published in Helsinki. Surprisingly enough, so it was published in 1942, a full version of it. The first part was already in 1938, but the full version was published in 1942. However, due to the Soviet occupation and war, it didn't reach Livonians. So it reached Livonians afterwards in end of 80s. The most notable object in Livonian Coast that reminds not only this cooperation for Livonians, but it's also as a symbolic. It has symbolic value as a that kind of example of Finno-Ugric cooperation in general, and this is the National House, Livonian National House, which was built by support of Livonians themselves, Estonia, Finland, Hungary, and also Latvia. And the author of the project is actually Finnish architect, Erkki Huttunen, who, there were 3 projects altogether. So one was Latvian made, one was Estonian made, but this one chosen and built was Erkki Huttunen's project. And if you go to the Livonian Coast, there is a little bit this Finnish feeling if you see that house, because that's not kind of functionalism that you would expect in Latvia. So it's a little different. And it was opened in 6th of August 1939. So just 1 year before Latvia's occupation, and this is why it actually couldn't manage to serve for long Livonian needs. So just less than a year later, it was nationalized. Livonian society was closed down. All the Livonian activities ceased and forbidden. And this Livonian community gave it back, or first gathered in this national house in 1989. So 50 years later, and the reason was precisely that, to celebrate 50 years of this Livonian national house. So, and because this was a moment where Livonians themselves kind of returned to Livonian Coast from all the places they were exiled. For people from abroad came, also from Finland for first time to Livonian Coast, who were allowed in. And so it was decided to have this on the first Saturday of August Livonian Festival. And since 1989, every year, the first weekend of August, there is Livonian Festival, which today is the biggest event and maybe the best possibility to introduce to Livonian culture. Of course, because most of the Livonian community living outside the Livonian Coast, the culture is in many senses kind of imported back there, but it is still very important place and time. And also at around the same time, there is another tradition that was born a couple of years later in 1992. There is a children's summer camp. Today it's called Children's Summer Camp and School. These are 10 days in the summer where children, again, from all the places they are living, they come together. And then for 10 days live in Mazirbe, trying to learn Livonian language, Livonian culture, and this is actually the sole program or kind of event that is really that you can as a kid study Livonian, and attendance is actually quite huge. So if I told about those 250 official Livonians during the summer camp, there are 48 kids this year were participating. So this is actually, this alone shows that, and these are only those who were allowed in because of coronavirus. So that actually the real interest would be much bigger. And this was the first year where this summer camp actually happened was it was for first year fully supported by Latvian Ministry of Education, which was a big achievement. And another Finnish person visiting Livonian Coast was Martti Ahtisaari back in 1996. He flew on a helicopter from Naantali to Livonian Coast, so it was quite interesting because they even made tarmac roads for that celebration leading to Mazirbe. So, and looking back, it's actually so one of the reasons why Livonians have managed to stay for so long is also that that Livonian identity is kind of very strong. So even being small in numbers, they are very active, and they are very, very proud of who they are. And this has been in all times. So in 19th century, one of the reasons why Livonians got problem was because they made a mess against local landlords. Also during the Soviet time, it was Livonians were still quite active on keeping their national identity, although for that time it was kind of very, very brave to do something like that. So in 60s what they did was that they used birthdays for gatherings. So the people just came together, so they celebrated big birthdays and they were talking Livonian, and next day everybody went to KGB. It was the same, which is just birthday party switched there. So what they came up with different solution in 1972. Actually, the solution idea about it came in 1971. The idea was that we have to legalize that because it's kind of boring just moving this party around. And then they decided that they would use the constitution of USSR and request special and folk groups made for Livonians in Riga and Ventspils simultaneously. And these became the places, so it was, they had official name of folk groups, but these became just like these cultural centers or societies where people came together. So they were singing, they were studying Livonian, they were speaking Livonian, and so this was the way how this Livonian culture survived also during the Soviet times. And they were during the Soviet times, although no books in Livonian were published, but they were making books. They were kind of writing them still. And then in 1978, one very important thing happened for Livonians, actually a number of important things. So first one was that in Soviet Union, list of the nations was shortened, and those nations being too small in numbers were erased from that. So basically, it meant that you were unable to get the name Livonian into passport. And that, of course, caused a protest letter written by Livonians, initiated by Livonians, and signed by many Latvian, big Latvian intellectuals. And it, of course, it ended with no result. But the idea itself, I think, is kind of very big act of bravery for that time, especially for such small community like Livonians. What they did next was they opened, but this plan existed also before. They opened memorial stone in Western Livonian capital, Pisa, or Miķertonis in Latvian, which commemorates 3 Livonian poets buried in the cemetery. So it was forbidden zone, so it was impossible to enter there. It was heavily militarized, and this it was just next to the big radio telescope that's currently Ventspils Radio Astronomy Center, which was in most top secret objects in Baltic states, also located in the Livonian Coast. And then they put this commemorating stone, and they also took in 4 buses full of people with singers, with Latvian intellectuals, poets, writers, painters, and they had a festival in this forbidden zone that you could like not enter even without visa. in 1978, and it was like there are still those big billboards where this, because they were printed because before it was forbidden, but despite the fact that it was forbidden, so they managed somehow to do that. And this activity somehow remains also today in this Livonian community. And so there are, the one thing is, and here we come to how I perceive living cultures or cultures with nations with a perspective or without perspective, because sometimes there is a kind of misconception that only those big in number are to stay alive at one moment. But for me, the difference is somewhere else, because it's there are two aspects for every nation and for every culture. So one aspect is the heritage. So how do we keep it? How do we use traditions, keep traditions, try to move them forwards? And in terms of tree, it shows like how do we approach our roots, because of course it's very important for every tree to have roots. But it is also important for every tree to have a trunk and leaves, because tree cannot grow only with roots. So it's important of these new things that are coming up, new culture being created language-wise, new words, etc. So because that is something that we are going to protect after 50, 100 years, we are looking back and saying, well, this is the heritage that we are protecting from that time. And if that process stops, then it means that, and this could only be done by the nation itself. So the nation dies when it decides that it doesn't want to have any future anymore. And in Livonian case, this is, I think, that gives most of the hope today and also tomorrow, because the Livonian community is really, really active. So you have this year there are two different Livonian festivals, bigger events. So one is Livonian Festival in the summer, and then there is Ventspils cultural days, which are more towards contemporary culture. Then you have 8 singing groups, again 250 people, 8 singing groups singing in Livonian. Of course, they are not professionals, everybody, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that people want to do things. People want to be to keep themselves this culture alive. On 30 readers, you can find 3 poets writing in Livonian, which is like kind of also a strange number. But it is, and it is not like Livonian poetry is also a tradition, because Livonian poetry has the same roots like Latvian literature. So first Livonian poet was actually the second poet writing in Latvian, and back in time, we have also these 200 years of writing in Livonian, and it has its own tradition. And in this newer time, there are 4, and since yesterday 5 books published in Livonian with Livonian poetry. And one of them, Trillium, which was meant for which was first Livonian poetry translations into English. So a year ago it received Latvian Literature Annual Award for what's in it. And that's actually the biggest recognition for Livonian literature ever, but on one hand, but on the other hand, it also shows that, well, yeah, Livonians are small in numbers, but you try to stay, even with with culture such small in numbers, but you somehow try to stay in the competition. So you're not the poetry that that has been published in Livonian in this newer time. It's not its main value is not being Livonian. Its main value is poetry. and Livonian just adds up. So yeah, and then if you go to Livonian Coast, it also starts to look quite different. In a sense, there are new expositions, new houses, and maybe the most interesting thing about Livonian Coast today, if you go there, then it is Livonian flag. So let's say 10 years ago, it was very different. So you could find some Livonian flags on Livonian homes, and then you knew that that there is living like hardliner Livonian, because he wants to show with this flag that this is his land and his place. But in this Livonian Coast, we are kind of very lucky. Livonian, I told this story about Livonian Coast emptying up, and it is actually quite empty place. So people think that maybe some eastern Latvia is his place with no people, but actually it's Livonian Coast, because it has never regained its former glory. So even after Soviet army gone, this border area opened, there are still, so if you go in the summer, so it's quite crowded because there are lots of people. Lots of people who have summer cottages there, but in the winter time, so there is, in my home village, a record was broken last year, so there was 8 people instead of 200 living before Second World War, and it's still empty during this winter time. And in 60s, 70s, people started to buy these summer cottages, but those who started to buy summer cottages were actually Latvian intellectuals, writers, painters, composers, and even today you can find quite a lot of those elite cultural people in Livonian Coast. But what they did, they had a respect for the heritage, respect for the homes that they are entering in. And you still see, you can see that respect in the way that they are building and how they are forming the coast. And we don't have exaggerations like around Jūrmala or other places. It's still, it has the same feeling. It has changed, it is still empty. It is quite desperate in the winter, because from my home village, nearest shop is 24 kilometers away. So, which is, for Latvia, it seems incredible, but that's the reality. And those people have also started to accept this Livonian heritage as part of theirs. So currently, they are also proudly using those Livonian flags. They want their homes being called in Livonian names. They are paying much more and more attention to Livonians. But that is also something that has to do with a greater change in Latvia in general, in this perception of Livonians. And that change is happening right now during the last years and during next years to come. Because when I went to school, it was still the perception of the most of the society was that Livonians went extinct in 13th century. So there was kind of, it has historical roots, because Livonians are Finnic people. So Livonians are not Baltic people, not even Indo-Europeans. And in the picture, if you try to define what Latvian is, it is kind of very hard to fit them in. So it is easy for Finnish, because most of, like, Finns are Finnic people, most of them are Lutheran. So then you have, it's easy in Lithuania, because it's also like it's at least one language group, and more or less one religious part. And then in Latvia, it's somehow you have every region very different. So there is, the diversity is actually Latvia's, for me, the core value that you have and this, that you have Catholics and you have Lutherans and you have Livonian heritage and you have Baltic old heritage and you have all this together. And but for one period in time where people try to define what Latvian is, so the perception was too straightforward. It was like Baltic, and it's actually language based, because Latvian is Baltic language, so Baltic tribes are Latvians, Finnic tribes not. And this somehow messed up quite a lot, and it still can be seen here and there. But now the greatest change that has happened since the restoration of independence of Latvia, and especially during last 10 years, is that the perception and knowledge of society of who Livonians are, and the fact that Livonians are itself has changed. So if in 80s, beginning of 90s, there was this idea that Livonians went extinct 13th century, so now it is very hard, though not impossible, but very hard, to find a person who would not know that Livonians exist today. And that is, like, it seems like a small change, but it's actually a huge step. Because that is where the understanding begins. When back in 90s, so you started almost every conversation in whatever, you wanted to write a project or you wanted to have some paper, but you started every conversation with convincing people that Livonians survived 800 years longer. So now you can really talk about what matters. You can skip all this introductory part. And during the recent years, I think that for first time there is this understanding that is building of not only of Livonians as something very interesting in terms of history, and because what Livonians basically are, it's a living dinosaur. It's something that has a history of more than 1,000 years, which is still present, it still can be found. But now it's also understanding, there is building understanding of that Livonians are not only something separate, but it is also a value that belongs to all Latvia. And Latvia would be a very different country. It would be a very different nation, very different language, if not Livonians there. And this is, I guess, in recent years, this paradigm change, it is really, really important. So that was, I don't know how short or long, but yeah, thank you. And it's